weekly BBL. This week, we have a rare treat. We have a former HCIL member and University of Maryland faculty member who was supposed to come several times. When he can tell us all the story if he wants to, but he was supposed to come when he was based here for a while at the Washington Post, and then we got delayed, and it was supposed to be in the spring, and then the pandemic hit, and then, well, finally we have him here. So Nick Diakopoulos is a associate professor now. Congratulations, by the way. I think that must have been a little while ago at Northwestern in the Communication Studies and Computer Science departments. And he's a big name in computational journalism. He's also got an appointment at University of Bergen, which I'm always a little jealous of. I'm Swedish myself. I'd love to have an appointment somewhere in Sweden or Norway so I could have an excuse to go home. And his big work, of course, he'll tell us all about it, I think, is on algorithmic bias and particularly its applications to media and automation. So I think that's what I'll introduce you. I'll let you do the rest. Of course, he'll talk about questions, but if you do have questions in the chat window, I will try to collect them and channel them. You can also ask questions. I mean, Nick can tell you how he wants to handle this, but you're also free to save your questions and if you want to ask them in person at the end.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. I just needed to unmute myself there. And hopefully y'all can see my slides that I'm sharing now. It's a real treat to be back virtually, at least, with the HCIL brown bag. It's been a few years. And thanks so much for the invitation. Yeah, so I think originally this visit was supposed to happen in the fall of 2019. And that was when I was in DC on a sabbatical to spend some time at the Washington Post working with their one of their newsroom engineering teams. And that got delayed, and then we were going to do it in the spring of 2020, and then the pandemic. And so here I am, winter of 2021. And it really feels like a bit of a time-space warp to think about 2019 at the Washington Post, but I'm happy to be here with you today. So I'm going to share a little bit about my my work, my research on algorithmic intermediaries, and so things like Google and Twitter and so on, and how those platforms are algorithmically shaping exposure to news information. So before I kind of dive in there, I also wanted to mention my book, which again, when I was going to give this talk in 2019, this would have been much more current. The book came out in June of 2019, but I wanted to at least give you a quick overview of the book. So, you know, basically, most of my research now relates to this idea of computational journalism and thinking about automation, algorithms, and AI in news production, and really sort of spanning the gamut in terms of how journalists use data mining techniques to find new and interesting stories. So that's the kind of work that I was doing actually at the Washington Post. To things like automated content production and how news articles can be automatically written based on data sets, things like news bots, not only the evil kind that you hear a lot about in the news media in terms of how bots are manipulating and propagandizing online, but also about more journalistically oriented, journalistically inspired uses of bots. And then also topics like algorithms and distribution of news and the investigation of algorithms, or sort of algorithmic accountability is how I would usually refer to that. And so my talk today is really going to be around these last two topics, algorithms and news distribution, and also how do we investigate these types of algorithms specifically. So sort of start here with the big the big platforms, Facebook and Google, this shouldn't be surprising to anyone, I don't think, that both of these platforms drive a tremendous amount of attention to news information. So something like 45% of US adults get news on Facebook, about 2/3 from social media in general. These numbers are constantly shifting over time, but that gives you a general gist of the scale. About half of US adults get news from Google. A quarter of adults say it's their main gateway to news information. And both of these platforms also drive a substantial amount of external referrer traffic to media sites. And that was actually something that was pretty apparent to me at the Washington Post, sort of the orientation of the news organization to platforms like these, as well as other platforms like Apple News and Twitter and so on. And really the degree of effort that went into sort of thinking about traffic patterns on these different platforms. So these are really big, important platforms, not only for news consumers, but also for news organizations. So how did I get into this? A few years ago, actually, this study was published in 2012. I saw a presentation by a data scientist who was at Facebook at the time, who showed this slide. And this slide sort of describes a study they had done in the 2012 elections at Facebook, looking at, I think it was almost 2 million Facebook users. And they matched at least some of those users to a post-election survey to find out how they actually voted in the election. And what they were studying was, so you'll see there's sort of a top panel and a bottom panel, and then within each of those panels, there's a row showing a control number and a row showing a boost number. So the boost part of the graph is showing a version of the newsfeed algorithm that actually increases the amount of hard news coverage that people are being shown in the feed. And the control condition is sort of your normal everyday algorithm that Facebook would apply otherwise. And so the top panel is showing the degree to which voter turnout, which is the variable on the x-axis, was increased in the boosted condition. And you can see that depending on how often the user logs in, whether or not they log in every day, which is the panel at the bottom, or log in less frequently than every day, there's sort of a different impact on turnout. But this was sort of a study that really captured my interest and inspired me to sort of dig into really the raw power of these platforms for exposing people to news information, and of course the implications of that exposure being, in this case, a change in voter turnout. So of course now we know algorithms are everywhere. Not only in search engines and platforms like Facebook, but they're used throughout society and in government and in industry. They're used in media for message targeting, content moderation, trending algorithms, personalization, and on and on and on. My sort of interest here is in this idea of algorithmic accountability. So with the proliferation of these algorithms in society and in media systems, a question that really appeals to me is, like, how do we investigate these systems? How do we try to explain these types of decisions that are being either exercised or informed by algorithms? And thinking about different stakeholders here, for researchers, journalists, or other stakeholders in civil society, how do we characterize the ways in which these algorithms are biased, the ways that they exert power and or influence people in society? And I should say, when I talk about algorithmic accountability, I'm not just talking about the technical aspect of the algorithm. I think it's important to sort of underscore that algorithms need to be understood as a composite of technology, woven together with people like designers, operators, owners, and maintainers of these socio-technical systems. And so algorithmic accountability is really about understanding how people exercise power within and through these systems and are ultimately responsible for these systems. In practice, a lot of my work ends up being descriptive. So it tends to try to describe what's going on with the algorithmic system with the hope that those types of descriptions can then inform other stakeholders in exerting pressure potentially on the people, on the stakeholders who then might affect change on these algorithmic systems. So let me advance here. So let me sort of start with Google here and kind of dive in there. Search, as I mentioned, is very important because about a third of news content is found via search, and more than half of Americans get news via search. So there's really a huge amount of power embedded in that search box. So another study that sort of captured my interest a few years ago now was published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences in 2015, and sort of described what they called the search engine manipulation effect, SEME. And what this study showed is that voting preferences, and they sort of repeated this experiment several times in different nations and so on. They show that the voting preferences of individuals can be linked to biases in the way in which information is presented to users in mock search results. So they created a mock search engine. They weren't looking at Google News or Bing or anything like that. They created their own search engine, and then they manipulated what people would see. So what you're seeing in sort of the A and B rows in this slide are a version of the search ranking where one candidate is treated very positively on the first page, and then in condition B, the other candidate is treated very positively on the first page, and then on down the rankings, you see that it switches from one candidate to the other. There's also a third condition, control condition, where they just alternated back and forth results from either of the two candidates. And what they found is that, all these conditions serve to shift the voter preferences of users in comparison to the control conditions. So condition C, where it was a random, not a random, but an alternated ordering. And they also found that conditions D and E, they tried different sort of distractors. So on the first page of results that was, say, positive for one of the candidates, they would insert one result that was positive for the other candidate. And these conditions D and E had the same sort of effect on people's intention to vote, but it was even less recognizable that the rankings were biased. In conditions A and B, some users were like, hey, what's going on here? These rankings seem like they're really pro one candidate or pro the other candidate. Something fishy is going on here. But in conditions D and E, they were far less likely to even recognize that. So what this, there are issues with this study in terms of ecological validity. Again, I mentioned it was a lab study, but what this study sort of got me thinking about is, again, just sort of the raw power of biased search rankings to draw attention of users in one way or another and potentially influence the way they're thinking about voting for candidates. So again, strong connection to democratic implications here. So this got us thinking about some of those limitations. I mentioned one of the criticisms of that study was a lack of ecological validity with their use of a mock search engine. So actually in late 2015, we got interested in studying sort of the real thing and looking at real search rankings and how rankings around candidates might be biased. And we wanted to sort of track the bias on different candidates and measure the degree of opposition or support bias in sort of the top 10 results. So, basically our results for one candidate or another more supportive of that candidate at the top of the ranking. So we started looking at the entire field of candidates in late 2015, and we collected the organic search results for those candidates. And then we rated how favorable each result was toward the candidate, sort of on a pro-con dimension. And then we plotted those in the next graph. So this is what those results look like. So on the x-axis is sort of the result rank from the first position to the last position on the first page of results. And then we have this favorability score on the y-axis, which is a measure of that pro-con spectrum. And what you can see, and then it's broken out by results for Democratic candidates and results for Republican candidates. So what you can see is a couple patterns here. One is that for both sets of candidates, you see this sort of this downward slope where at the top of the page it tends to be more favorable to the candidate, and at the bottom of the page it tends to be less favorable to the candidate. The difference between Republicans and Democrats is that on average, the Republican candidates are portrayed with more favorable results than the Republican candidates. This is what the results look like broken out by the candidates that we tracked. So at the time we collected data, there were far more Republicans in the field than Democrats in the field. And you can see sort of the ratings, the orange ratings are sort of the con ratings, and then the purple ratings are the pro ratings. So you sort of just visually, you can see there's a lot more orange up for the Republicans than there is for the Democrats. You know, in some follow-up work, we got interested in studying what types of images are selected for candidates, since we know that visual representation can also impact voter attitudes. I'm not going to dive into those results today, but just to sort of mention that that's an aspect of these studies that we also looked at. What I am going to focus on a little bit more is our results looking at the section of the results page in this in the screenshot I'm showing you here. It's labeled in the news. They actually changed that, so now it's labeled top stories. So I'm going to show you a study that we did where we sort of focused in on that top stories section of search results. So the research questions that we were pursuing here in terms of the top stories was basically, does Google top stories provide a diverse set of sources? What's the range of ideological perspectives in news sources that are portrayed there? And then the second research question, sort of, how does this Google top stories box actually influence attention to news information? So I'll actually show you some evidence for how much attention this part of the search results drives. So I think I mentioned before, a lot of these studies end up being descriptive and sort of, as is typical of audit studies, you know, we started by defining a set of queries that we wanted to audit, and then looking at the results of those queries. So for this particular study, we wanted to focus on queries related to hard news. So these would be queries related to like political events going on in the news, you know, with some kind of implications for the public. So these would be like stories about the government, elections, global affairs, economics, stories about sports results, celebrities, or like you know, company reports would generally not be considered hard news. But of course, there's a little bit of subjectivity here. You know, certainly sexual abuse story, for instance, about a celebrity could be hard news to the extent that it maybe contributes to some sort of larger conversation that's happening. So, so we sort of focused in on hard news. We looked at Google Trends data once a day for a month in 2017. And then we selected queries that met our criteria for hard news. In terms of data collection, we then sort of scraped out all of the stories in this top news section at the top of the page. We scraped those once a minute for 24 hours. So every day we would collect new queries, and for that day we would scrape those queries once a minute to get all of the top stories that were showing up there on a minute-by-minute basis. We did also collect the organic links, so those are those other blue links on the first page, including the source and time information there. And in all, we captured about 6,300 top stories articles this way. So here's sort of top level description here to give you a sense for the distribution of impressions that we observed in that top stories box. So again, we're looking at an impression as one sort of appearance of a news source in a search result. And you can see here that amongst the top 20 sources, there's a large degree of concentration. So I think 52% of impressions in all went to these top 20 sources. In fact, if you look at the top 20% of news sources, that accounted for 86% of impressions. So a lot of the attention is getting funneled to a relatively smaller number of news outlets. You can see CNN, New York Times, and the Washington Post really sort of dominate more than 20% of the impressions on these queries. So that's sort of an interesting finding just there in terms of thinking about how an intermediary like Google is narrowing the space of information that people are seeing most frequently. We were also interested in the ideological distribution of the news sources that we saw there. And so to look at that, we actually leveraged a data set that was released from Facebook based on one of their earlier studies looking at ideological diversity on Facebook, where they had collected ratings of the 500 most shared news organizations on Facebook. And they were looking at how often those stories and looking at the degree to which there was an alignment between the news source and the political, the stated political alignment or affiliation of the individual on Facebook. So it's important to keep in mind that there's different ways of defining ideological diversity. In this case, using this data from Facebook, they define it in terms of the sources that people share. So if right-leaning people tend to share Fox News more often, then Fox News will be labeled as a more right-leaning outlet. So the ratings range from -1, which is more left, to +1, which is more right. And this is sort of what we found in terms of the distribution. You can see there's sort of a dominant prevalence towards left-leaning outlets, far fewer sources that were labeled as right-leaning outlets, and a good chunk of them that were where we didn't have data to label them. But even if we were to add the no data to the red bar here, the blue bar would be bigger. So this sort of gives you a sense for the overall aggregate pattern. I think it's I also want to note that there's a fair bit of variance here in terms of what the distribution looks like for different search terms or search queries. So out of the 188 search terms that we were auditing, 161 had a left-leaning average ideological score in terms of the sources that were being surfaced, and 22 had a right-leaning average ideological score. There were some differences there, not to be totally lost in this aggregate picture. An alternate hypothesis here is that maybe Google's algorithm is just maybe Google's algorithm is biased towards selecting left-leaning sources, but what if there just happens to be more news content being produced on the left? Google could just be reflecting the greater availability of news on the left. And this is certainly a viable hypothesis. There is work that has shown that there does tend to be more news produced on the left than on the right. So to sort of check this, we created a baseline where we collected, for the same set of query terms, we collected articles from GDELT, which is a very large database that tracks news information across, I think, almost 100,000 news sources online. And we looked at sort of the ratio of left versus right-leaning sources in the Google articles that we found versus that ratio in the GDELT articles that we found. And you can see in the right-hand column here, for Google articles, it's 3.2 times as many left versus right-leaning. For GDELT, it's 2.2 times as many left versus right-leaning. So certainly there is this prevalence of more left versus right-leaning content online in general, Google seems to inflate the left-leaning stuff even a little bit more. So it sort of exacerbates that skew toward the left a little bit, at least in terms of our data. And of course, I have to caveat all of these kinds of statements, not claiming that Google is totally biased toward the left and they're just trying to use their algorithm to promote left-leaning media. This needs to be interpreted in the context of the types of queries that we're auditing and the time frame that we're looking at, and so on. So what? What does this all mean in terms of who is exposed to what information and how often? That's kind of the second question that we were driving at here, which is how does Google actually shape attention to this news information? So all of what I've showed you is just exposure level information. It doesn't tell you anything about what people are actually clicking on. So what can we learn here? So for this part of the study, I actually collaborated with Chartbeat, which is a news analytics provider that tracks news to traffic to news articles across a very large number of news sites. For the news sites that we had in our data, Chartbeat had refer information for about 42% of the articles. So, decent coverage of the data we had collected from Google, which allows us to link how much traffic to those specific articles was being referred from the Google homepage. So one thing I want to mention here is that refer data actually can't differentiate between a click from a link in the top stories section of the results versus a click in the organic section of the results. We only got one sort of aggregate refer volume number from Chartbeat. And so we also made use of the data that we collected about the presence of news articles in the organic search results in order to model how the visibility of a link on a search result page might be converting to a link. So to model this, we looked at the top stories impressions, so the number of appearances of links there, and also organic impressions of articles as predictors of the number of referrals to those articles from Google, as measured by Chartbeat. And to do that, we used a negative binomial regression for over-dispersed count data, which models our data effectively. And we created dummy variables to group on query term because attention to different queries varies quite a lot. And here's what the results look like. So just to focus your attention a little bit on model number one, modeling the overall number of organic impressions and the top stories impressions. And the beta coefficient is sort of telling us how much to what degree one impression in search results is converting to a referral to actual traffic for that article. So just to interpret this a little bit for model one additional impression on the top stories is associated with a 0.17% increase in more referrals to that story. And I should add that one impression here happens every minute, the way we measure impressions. So an article receiving, say, 60 impressions in the top stories box because it's there for an hour, once every minute, you would expect it to receive about 10 to 11% more referrals just from having been in that box. Organic impressions were a little bit less powerful in terms of driving clicks, though not by much. The ratio was 0.15%. Model number two basically breaks out the position of the top stories. So remember, we have 3 dominant positions in the top stories: left, center, and right. And we also modeled that to look at which position in the top stories led to more referral traffic. And you can see based on the beta coefficient that actually the middle spot, the rank number 2 in top stories generated the most referral traffic. Okay, so cognizant of time, I kind of want to move forward here and share another recent study where we've been looking at Apple News. and sort of looking at auditing how the trending algorithm on Apple News shapes attention in contrast or in comparison to the top stories on Apple News. So if I were there with you all, I would probably say, hey, how many of you have used Apple News? It doesn't work as well on Zoom, but given that they have more than 90 million users in the US, I'm going to assume that at least a few of you use Apple News or have used Apple News. So for those of you who maybe haven't, this is what it looks like. At the top on the left, you can see Apple News tends to start at the top of the app with a section called Top Stories. Typically, as you scroll down, there's about 5 top stories, although that varies depending on what device you're on. And then as you scroll down through the app, you will hit another section called Trending Stories, which is shown here on the right. And typically, again, the number varies a little bit, but typically there's 4, sometimes there's 6, depending on if you have a larger device. So we're sort of interested in auditing and comparing the sources and the type of content that, that appear in these different sections of the app. So here's the research questions that we came up with. We're interested in things like, how often does Apple News update content? Does it localize or personalize content? What's the concentration and distribution of sources that people are exposed to there? And what topics are shown most often? Now, in terms of auditing Apple News, this was a little tricky because unlike Google search, it's not just a web page that you can load in a browser and scrape. And there's no public API for it either. And there's some security techniques that Apple uses to prevent you from scraping it. So we ended up actually using an app QA program called Appium, which you can run in the iOS simulator on your Mac. There's a service called Mac in Cloud. So we used a cloud provider for a Mac platform and then ran a simulator there. And we're able to load this Appium program, which simulates an iOS device, and then essentially script an interaction pattern that allowed us to extract the links from these different sections. We also used some crowdsourcing methods on Mechanical Turk for our assessments of how personalization was impacting content on the app. And again, sort of like going quickly through these results. Sorry, I don't have time to sort of dig into all of the methods details, but I will refer you to these articles at the end of my talk, and I hope you'll sort of read into them if you're really interested in building on these methods. But basically, the sort of an initial part of our audit was about trying to determine if trending stories were personalized or not. And so we used crowdsourcing of synchronized screenshots of that section of the app to look at whether or not people in different locations who are looking at the app at the same time see the same set of stories. And then we also compared those screenshots from people to automatically scraped results of those sections. And as you can see in this table here, where we're sort of summarizing results, we found no evidence of personalization or localization in the app. Now, I actually know from after having published this study, Apple News got in touch with me and I had a nice, interesting conversation with them. And it turns out that, in fact, we're right, there's no personalization, but it is also something that they dabbled in. They have kind of done some experiments with personalization. They just haven't implemented it or rolled it out. The other thing I want to draw attention to here is sort of the concentration, sort of the bottom row of this table. So if we look at the top 10 news sources that we observed on Apple News, in the trending section, those top sources accounted for about 75% of articles. And if we look at the top stories, which are again, those manually curated articles that are selected by editors for Apple News, there's only about 56% of articles are captured by those 10 sources. So what this says is basically that trending sources, the sources in trending stories are more narrow. There's a fewer number of sources that is concentrating more attention on those sources. Whereas the top story section is a little bit more spread out, or a little bit more diverse inclusion of different sources. Now, both sections had about 83 to 87 sources, but they weren't the same 80 some odd sources. There was about 40 or so that were overlapped, and then the other 40 or so that were unique to that section. Here's a different view to show just sort of aggregate patterns here of the concentration of attention. So similar to the Google results, we see Washington Post and CNN highly ranked, certainly for top stories on Apple News. And you can sort of contrast this with the trending news stories on Apple, which where you see also CNN is ranked quite highly, but you also see Fox News, People, BuzzFeed, Vanity Fair, Newsweek, eOnline. So you see some of these more entertainment, celebrity-oriented types of stories, sources showing up more often in the trending section of Apple News. I also want to add that I did, in some follow-up work, look at sort of the local, regional, national distribution of sources. So I found that the top story section overwhelmingly included stories from national outlets. Sometimes they pulled from local and regional publications like the LA Times or the Chicago Tribune, but that was only about a quarter of the sources that they pulled up, that they used, and about 8% of the articles that were featured in that section. Meanwhile, for the trending stories section of the app, there was a single locally or regionally specific source that we observed in the time frame that we audited. One other observation I want to make here before I move on is just you can also see in the trending story section a greater prevalence of soft news showing up. Again, related to more entertainment, celebrity types of things. So maybe one more view here comparing the source rates in the top and trending sections. So on the left-hand side, you can see the rate in the top stories. On the right-hand side, you can see the rate in the trending stories. So you can get a feel for the contrast here. Whereas Fox News rarely showed up at top stories, it showed up in trending stories quite a lot. Same with People. Another sort of standout there is BuzzFeed. Almost didn't show up in the top stories, but showed up a lot in trending stories. And so on. So, you know, it was sort of some interesting divergences there. We also looked at the headlines that occurred in each section and compared the key terms that appeared in those headlines. And, you know, as maybe is not surprising at this point, the headlines in the trending section tended to refer more to celebrities. Donald Trump and his family were there frequently. Oftentimes you would see shocking or sensational headlines there. Actually, we counted Florida man in the headlines of 11 stories that were featured in the trending section of Apple News. So if you're not familiar with Florida man, Google it and you'll find some interesting Wikipedia information on that. In contrast, the top story section reflected more substantive political issues, topics like health, Affordable Care Act, immigration. You know, we were talking about the border wall, about sanctuary cities at the time, and also international politics and events came up there. So a very clear contrast in terms of the focus of the content between those two sections. Okay, in the last few minutes here, before we sort of open it up to questions more broadly, I wanted to talk about some of our latest work, also looking at the Alexa device. So, you know, we've been sort of getting curious about news curation on different platforms and looking at the concentration of sources and so on Google and Apple. For Alexa, we were interested more in the quality of the information that was being conveyed. And the reason for that is that when you ask Alexa for news information, in contrast to a search results page where you can browse, or even Apple News where you can sort of browse through links, on Alexa, you just get typically one response. So they have one shot to get you an answer to your query. And we thought that the stakes are a little bit higher there in terms of the quality of the response that they're giving you. So we wanted to look at the quality of information there. Now, many of you probably have these devices at home. Based on some of the surveys that NPR has published, about 1 in 4 US adults have a smart speaker at home, and about 2/3 of that market in the US is with the Alexa. So we wanted to sort of start there. Now, about 3/4 of the users of smart speakers use them to answer general questions, and about 42% say they often use these devices to search for news information. So again, even though most attention to news is driven by these other platforms, we're sort of looking at this as a nascent platform where people are going to get news information. So here's a little bit of detail on what we audited here. The first challenge with a device like this is, of course, the query is less of a keyword query and more of a spoken phrase query. So we ended up crowdsourcing different phrasings for news queries on Mechanical Turk, and then we were able to sort of cluster those. We did some text analysis to cluster different patterns of queries, and we ended up narrowing it down to these 4 patterns. So what happened, what is going on, can you tell me about, and what is new? And of course, the preposition could vary depending on what the event or noun is that's completing the phrase. So we ended up capturing trending topics from Google, from Google Trends again. This was for a couple of weeks in late 2019, and we collected about 1,100 queries and responses this way. I guess I should also mention that so on a methodological note, this was interesting because we were sort of initiating all of the queries using text to speech, and then also recording the responses and using speech to text in order to capture the responses and evaluate the responses. And I don't have time to go into all the details here, but if you look at our paper, which will be out at CSCW this year, we look at sort of the implications of this speech to text and text to speech process in terms of transcription accuracy, how that affects how we audit these things, these types of devices, and so on. So here's our analytic framework for looking at the data that we collected. We looked at whether or not Alexa gives a response. We looked at whether or not Alexa understood a response in terms of whether it was transcribed accurately in a transcription test. We looked at the relevance of the response. Again, we're interested in quality here of the responses. So we looked at the relevance of responses, we looked at the accuracy of responses, and we looked at the timeliness of responses. And here's what we found in sort of aggregate. So Alexa does pretty well with responding, about 92%. So a no response is when the speaker basically doesn't acknowledge that you asked it a question, and it provides no response to the user. Of those 92%, 76% were understood, meaning that when we tested the transcription accuracy of that query, it was able to transcribe, to sort of survive the text to speech and also speech to text. 72% of the understood responses were relevant, which means about 16% were irrelevant and about 12% provided no information. So actually this 12% is like when Alexa responds and says something like, "I'm sorry, I can't help you with that," or "I'm sorry, I'm not sure about that." And 72% were actually relevant. We know that some of the irrelevant responses were probably due to transcription errors or misunderstood queries. But sometimes it's also like a mismatch in context. So there was one query that we looked at that was Popeye's chicken was trending on Google, and so that was one of our queries. So it's like, if you can imagine, one of our queries was like, what's, what happened at Popeyes? So that was one of our queries, it ended up, this was actually a hard news story. There's actually someone who was killed over a Popeye's chicken sandwich. I forget the exact date when this happened. It was right in that time frame when we were collecting data. But the device responded with an answer about the cartoon character Popeye. So clearly, a sort of a mismatch in like, hey, I'm asking about this news event that's going on, but the device is responding with this sort of generic Wikipedia-like answer. In terms of accuracy and timeliness, I will say the device does pretty well. Like 99% of the relevant responses were accurate and 94% of the relevant responses were timely. So when you did ask for information and get a relevant response, it was typically accurate and it was typically pretty timely. Now, one tweak to these results I want to talk about briefly is how they differ across phrasings. So just very, very quickly, this chart is showing the number or the proportion of relevant, no information, and irrelevant queries broken out by the query phrasing that we tested. And just at a sort of macro level, you can see the dark blue bars are longer for the "can you tell me about" and "what happened" phrasings than for the "what is going on" and "what is new" phrasings. So this is just sort of high-level aggregate results that gives you a feel for how the quality of information that you get with Alexa can actually depend on how you phrase your question, and in terms of in terms of the relevance or irrelevance of information that it's getting you. We also looked at the information sources. Again, we're broadly interested in sort of the provenance of information, where is information coming from, as a signal of quality. And so you can sort of see the breakout here. In aggregate, we found that 60% of all the understood responses had a sort of unknown source provenance. So we don't know where the information came from. So for the other 40%, we have some sense. And typically, Amazon Alexa is pulling on Wikipedia very frequently. That was present in almost 19% of responses where there was a source mentioned. There's also these other categories, like other captures a set of sources that refers to things like IMDb or other reference sites like reference.com. And you can see in the dark blue here, news sources are cited very, very infrequently and as sources of information for these responses. In fact, only 1.4% of the sources that were mentioned were news sources. And of those, it was only 2 news sources, Reuters and the Washington Post. And so that's kind of surprising, given that we were querying about news-related queries. So I'm not going to try and squeeze in one more study here, but this is just a teaser that we're doing similar kinds of audits on Twitter right now. We have a study that will be out also at CCW this year, where we look at comparing the chronological feed on Twitter to the algorithmic feed on Twitter, and how that impacts sort of the number of accounts you see, the types of links that you see, the content that you see, the ideology of the sources that you see, and so on. So I hope you'll check that out as well. So in closing, I just want to make a few comments here about some kind of high-level takeaways. In general, my lab, the computational journalism lab at Northwestern, we're sort of approaching these audits as an opportunity to think through different methodologies that we need in order to audit algorithms in the media system. So, looking at things like crowdsourcing, looking at things like, how do you audit a device that only responds to spoken queries? In the Twitter work, how do you efficiently audit an algorithmic feed when you can't observe, a representative sample of accounts because of API limitations and so on. So there's a whole host, I hope if you go in and sort of read the studies here, there's a whole host of methodological advances that I think enable these types of studies. In general, sort of thinking across these studies, there's also implications for source and attention concentration. Pretty much without fail, our results indicate a lot of concentration of attention to a relatively smaller number of news sources. And that's important for a few reasons. I mean, one, it's important because we're not talking about filter bubbles per se here, but we are talking about shaping the attention that people give to news to a sort of relatively smaller number of typically mainstream news outlets. So if we're coming at this from a question of like how diverse is the media that we're consuming, these devices, these platforms tend to shape our attention and concentrate our attention. There's also another way to look at that from a more industry point of view, which gets at sort of the economic implications of this, right? If a platform like Google or Apple or Twitter is really concentrating attention to a few news sources, then those news sources are the ones that are reaping the attentional rewards of that process, right? They're getting the refers, which means they're getting the ad revenue from showing ads to those people or potentially converting those people into subscribers. Another sort of high-level takeaway here, both from the Google study and also the Alexa study, is how the choice of query that you're using to audit here it sort of matters in terms of the results that you're able to get out. So just looking at aggregate patterns is helpful, but we sort of need to also drill into specific queries, specific like framings around queries, like people from different backgrounds might frame or use a different frame or phrase on a query. And so we need to look and think about how that may impact the information that people are exposed to as well. And then the final point I'll just make before we get to questions is sort of this difference between algorithmic and editorial logics and curation. So this was very salient in the Apple News case, just looking at the type of content that surfaces in the top story section in comparison to the trending story section, how trending stories tends to include soft news, whereas top stories tends to include more sort of hard news, international stories, stories about political policy and so on. And just sort of thinking broadly about, and I will say we found a similar pattern in the Twitter study, which I didn't get into. But we're sort of starting to see this pattern where, the more you're applying algorithmic curation, the more and relying on trendiness and popularity signals, the more you're kind of leaning into more softer framings of news. And I don't want to totally dismiss soft news as unimportant. There are ways for people to come into news and be introduced to news through a sort of a soft news frame. But I think it's something to be aware of how these algorithms are sort of shaping the frame and the texture of the news that we're being exposed to. So I know I'm over time. I apologize for that, but thank you very much. Happy to be in touch. And here are a few of the references for papers that I talked about today. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Nick. We have a few questions. I think Beth is making it possible for everyone to unmute themselves. There was a question a little earlier that I didn't want to interrupt you. That was my bad. So Ed Summers was asking a question. Ed, are you around and do you want to ask your question, or should I just ask it for you? It's up to you.
Yeah, sure, I can ask it. Thanks, Nick, for this, presentation of all these different studies you've done. I was curious about, so the first one, just returning to the beginning about, looking at the Google search results using the trending, the Google Trends. And maybe I kind of misunderstood, but I was curious about sort of like the scope of the algorithm that you were studying. So it struck me that, using the Google Trends as a way into Google search results may tell you more about Google Trends than it does about Google search results. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, and I think I tried to allude to this at one point by mentioning that I think we always need to take into account the query formulation strategy in interpreting the results of these types of audits. So that's why I'm always a little bit cautious to make these big grand claims of like, well, Google does this or Google does that. I mean, obviously, only Google is really sitting on the ability to audit, a complete sampling of the ways that people query for information on their platform. And I think it is fair to say, and I could probably make that connection even clearer when I present this work, insofar as the choice of queries there is coming from trends may be shaping the results that we're seeing a little bit more directly. That said, I mean, we did sample from the trends, so we were trying to apply this definition of hard news to the trends to try to get at some of those more newsy, public interesting kinds of queries. But I mean, those queries that we're trying to was getting traction at that moment. But yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's an important one to keep.
There's another question from Anton that came a little while ago. Do you want to ask it, Anton, or should I ask it for you?
Oh, sure, I can ask it. You mentioned that Alexa was only using Washington Post and I think Reuters. Is that right?
Yeah.
Right. I wonder if Alexa has to get rights to revoice stories, and perhaps it's just easier to do that with Washington Post, given who owns it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a fair conjecture. I don't know why we only saw content from those two sources. I suspect there's a legal grounding, like Amazon had an agreement with Reuters to provide some news information. I mean, keep in mind that it was only in 1.4% of queries that a news source was mentioned at all. So to me, it seems more like Amazon just really isn't keyed into the idea of news information as a domain that warrants sort of more widespread and timely updating of their knowledge of what's going on in the world in order to be able to respond to these types of queries. So, but yeah, point taken. I think there's probably some legal basis for why we saw that particular result.
Mm-hmm. But somebody could get an Alexa skill, can upload some sort of Alexa skill that would tie them into NPR or something else, right?
Yes, they can. Right. And that's an important thing I forgot to mention. We did not audit that third-party ecosystem of news skills. We thought that would sort of open things up in a way that we weren't prepared to sort of address. And it sort of focuses the study on like, what do you get out of the box, right? I mean, this was sort of a factory default setting Alexa that we were auditing.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Let's see, Greta. So we're at 1:30 almost. So of course, if anyone has to go by this time, we obviously understand. But hopefully, you can keep Nick along for the additional questions. I see you had a question here, Greta. If you're still here.
I've never heard the term soft news, and I was just wondering what you meant.
Yes. Sorry for not defining that more clearly. So yeah, we have this distinction between soft news and hard news that we use in several of our studies, and I could certainly point you toward the references in the paper, but I'm just sort of pulling up my notes here. I think for let's see, for the Google stuff, we define hard news as those that are oriented around societal issues of importance to the public. So this would include stories about government, elections, global affairs, or economics, things like sports results, celebrities, or updates on individual companies. would generally not be considered hard news, although they could be if there's an angle of talking about that celebrity that sort of hits on a societal issue that's of broad importance. So there is a subjective element to defining that. Soft news, would be more entertainment, celebrity, things that aren't generally considered to be broadly relevant to how we live in society. It's a distinction that sort of has been made in journalism space in terms of the type of content that news organizations produce and distribute.
There's a question from Ben about fake news.
Hi, Nick. Good to see you back here at HCIL. Thank you for your always thorough, thoughtful studies. And as you know, I'm interested in misinformation and fake news, and wondered, I mean, all the sources you cited in the other one and the Alexa all seem to be real news. Where's all the fake news?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Where's the fake news? It turns out these platforms sort of cleaned up their act pretty good in 2016, 2017, at least in terms of the curated portions of these services that we've been auditing. So the top story section of Google, there's a list of sources that Google is more cautious about curating into that section. Now, if you go back before 2016, when we had started doing some of this work in 2015, you did see some odd sources in there, but people weren't really talking about misinformation in the way that they were starting in 2016 just yet. Google cleaned a lot of that stuff up in 2016. And so by the time we were collecting data in 2017, we weren't seeing any of that kind of stuff pop up. Similarly, in Apple News, they control the sources that are available in Apple News. It's not like any website online can show up in Apple News. And so there's a set of editors there who have curated the sources and said, well, these are the ones that are allowed to be in the app. And that I think tends to work as a way to clamp down on misinformation. I think it's sort of similar for Amazon in terms of how they're operating as well, and sort of the sources they're pulling on. I mean, they are pulling on Wikipedia very often, and that can introduce some inaccuracies and so on. But to a large extent, they're doing a pretty good job.
Good to hear. Thank you.
I see a question by Aishwarya.
Hello. Yeah, I was curious in the Alexa study how you would recalibrate or clear the Alexa machine between different types of phrasing or different variables you would add to it, or would it just adapt as you changed it up?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but yeah, I mean, we would query each phrasing one at a time, and we would wait. I forget, maybe a minute or two in between each query.
Or would it? So if you were using a certain type of phrasing, would it filter the news articles to that type of phrasing? But then if you switched dramatically, like how?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So in one of the results that I showed you, there were some differences between query phrasings. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the differences were dramatic, but there were some differences in terms of the results that you would get. Phrasing a query in different ways. I think one of the interesting areas for follow-up work there is to actually look at whether or not there were correlates, like socio-demographic correlates to phrasing selection. So, do different cultures have different preferred phrasings for asking for particular forms of information? And does that relate to the quality of information that the device is then able to provide? That could be another way to sort of think about that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
There's a follow-up question by Anton about climate and climate change. Did you want to ask that, Anton?
Oh, just still trying to understand the distinction between hard news and soft news as you defined it. Where did science and tech fall? Where would climate fall?
Yeah, it's not really about the topic. It's about the way the topic is talked about. So if a climate story could be soft if it's framed as I don't know. I would have to generate some soft news frame on climate, but I'm convinced that you could have a soft news frame on it versus hard news, which would be, you know, I don't know, the average temperature is up 1 degree Celsius this year or something like that, where it's very clearly like related to the public conversation going on climate change. Science and technology, you know, sometimes it's soft, sometimes it's not. Just depends on, you know, if you're talking about technology and gaming on the latest Xbox through the lens of an entertainment reporter and someone who's interested in looking for the latest games to entertain themselves, and that would be soft news. But if you're looking at gaming and its relationship to teenage behavior and teenage aggression, then maybe that's a hard news frame on that topic. So it is really sort of, you sort of have to look at it. And as we were looking at our queries and sort of defining them as hard news or not hard news, we were looking at the context around that query to see what types of stories were popping up around that query in order to help make that distinction.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, I think those are the questions. I think we should thank Nick for taking the time and stay extra long for all these questions. Thank you so much for finally coming. And
really appreciate it.
And hope we can host you for real at some point too in the HCIL. You can come back and check out your old haunts.